For only one moment, I paused to get my breath and to lean on my shovel. Unfortunately, the guard turned around just then and thought I was loafing. The pain he caused me was not from any insults or any blows. That guard did not think it was even worth his while to say anything, not even a swear word, to the ragged, emaciated figure standing before him, which probably reminded him only vaguely of a human. Instead, he playfully picked up a stone and threw it at me. That, to me, seemed the way to attract the attention of a beast, to call a domestic animal back to its job, a creature with which you have so little in common that you do not even punish it. This is one of the opening chapters for a book by Viktor E. Frankl that was a phenomenal book, and I think any young man should read this book, and it should be a crucial part of their life. This is the story of Viktor E. Frankl that was a prisoner inside of a concentration camp during World War II. I shall never forget how I was roused one night by the groans of a fellow prisoner who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare. Since I had always been especially sorry for people who suffered from fearful dreams or deliria, I wanted to wake up the poor guy. Suddenly, I drew back the hand which was ready to shake him, frightened at the thing I was about to do. At that moment, I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to bring him back to. In spite of all the enforced physical and mental privativeness of the life in the concentration camp, it was possible for spiritual life to deepen. Sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered a lot of pain, but the damage to their internal selves was less. They were able to retreat from the terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. Only in this way can one explain the apparent paradox that some prisoners of a less hardy life often seem to survive camp life better than those of a robust nature. Let me tell you what happened on those early mornings when we had to march to our campsite. There were shouted commands: detachment, forward, march, left 2 3 4, left 2 3 4, left 2 3 4, first man about, left and left and left and left, caps off. These words sound in my ears even now. At the order caps off, we passed the gate of the camp, and the searchlights were trained upon us. Whoever did not march smartingly got a kick, and worse off was the man who, because of the cold, had pulled his cap back off his ears before permission was given. We stumbled on in the darkness over big stones and through large puddles, along the one road leading from the camp. The accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with the butts of their rifles. Anyone with very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk. Hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, the man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now. I do hope that they are better off in the camps and don't know what is happening to us." That brought thoughts of my own wife to mind, and as we stumbled on for miles, slipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and time again, dragging one another up and onward, nothing was said. But we both knew. Both of us were thinking of our wives. Occasionally I looked at the sky, where the stars were fading and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise that morning. After a while of this heinous torture, the camp inmate was then frightened of making any decisions and taking any sort of initiative whatsoever. This was the result of a strong feeling that fate was one's master and that one must not try to influence it in any way but instead let it take its own course. At times, lighting decisions had to be made, decisions which spelled life or death. The prisoner would have preferred to let fate make the choice for him. This escapes formed commitment, which was most apparent when a prisoner had to make the decision for or against an escape attempt. In those minutes in which he had to make up his own mind, and it was always a question of minutes, he suffered the tortures of hell. Should he make the attempt to flee, and should he take the risk? Viktor Frankl then opens up another argument shortly after and says that he might give the impression that the human being is completely and unavoidably influenced by his surroundings, right? That the book is kind of putting off this type of impression. And what he's referring to specifically is the case of the surroundings being the unique structure of the camp life, which forced the prisoner to conform his conduct to a certain set pattern and certain way of doing things. But he then asks, what about human liberty? Is there no spiritual freedom in regard to behavior in reaction to any given surroundings? Is that theory true, which would have us believe that man is no more than a product of many conditional and environmental factors, whether it be biological, psychological, sociological? Is man only an accidental product of these? Most importantly, do the prisoner's reactions to the singular word of the concentration camp prove that man cannot escape the influences of his surroundings? Does man have no choice of action in the face of such circumstances? He then goes into answering these types of questions. We can answer these questions from experience as well as on principle. The experiences of camp life show that man, despite everything that they had went through, absolutely does have a choice of action. He explains, there were enough examples, often of a heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome. Man can preserve a prestige of spiritual freedoms, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychological and physical stress. He would see men walking through the huts and comforting others, and also in many heroic acts, even giving up their last bits of food that they have. He says that there may have been only a few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing cannot, which is the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, and to choose one's own way. He explains that there were always choices to make, although it looked like on the surface there was no decisions for them to make. He says that every day offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very inner freedom. Specifically, which determined whether or not you would become the thing of circumstance, renouncing the freedom and the dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. What he's talking about here is exactly the profile of the two individuals that were going around and offering bread, right? Instead of stooping down to the horrible environment and the horrible circumstance that they were in, what they did was they rised above it, and they still kept their moral attitude, their moral principles, and tried to become better and bring optimism to all the other inmates. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways, in the final analysis, it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision and not the influence of the camp alone. Fundamentally, he argues, that allows any man, even under any circumstance, to decide what shall become of him, both mentally and spiritually. An active life serves the purpose of giving man the opportunity to realize values in creative work, while a passive life of enjoyment affords him the opportunity to obtain fulfillment in experiencing beauty, art, or nature. But there is also a purpose in that life, which is almost barren of both creation and enjoyment, and which admits of but one possibility of high moral behavior. Specifically, in man's attitude to his existence, an existence restricted by external forces. The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. This could mean by remaining to stay brave, dignified, and unselfish, or it could mean for the bitter fight for self-preservation, for you to forget all human dignity and become no more than just an animal. What he means here is to basically hold yourself to a higher standard of life despite your circumstances. Whether it's you want to do something, you want to start going to the gym, you want to eat healthier, you want to stick to a habit, right? Despite your circumstances, you need to always stick to those principles and that way of life. That's what he's saying here. He then explains afterwards, saying that if there is any meaning to life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is a guaranteed part of life, just as much as fate and death. And without suffering and human death, life cannot be complete. The reason that I love this so much is it basically flips the view of suffering. Because every time someone thinks of suffering, they immediately associate it to something related to like escaping it or hardship. But what it actually becomes is an opportunity to show character, right? To face the issue at hand, the hardship at hand, but to face it bravely and stay human and to not give in and lose yourself. Another thing that I love so much that Victor touches on is it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. He says that we needed to stop thinking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life, daily and hourly. And he says that our answer must not consist in talk and meditation, but in the right action and the right conduct. This is really good because what you see nowadays is a lot of people talking about these things that they want to do, the changes that they want to make in their life. They want to meditate on it. They want to manifest it. But the way that you should really get it done is by taking actual proper action and getting it done. He then says, life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. His approach is such a pragmatic approach. That's why I think it's so meaningful, and that's why I think it can be related to so many different people, is because everybody goes through such different circumstances. People have different things going on in their life. People have different problems that occur, and they're so unpredictable. But the way that you should approach this is to look at it as a problem that needs to be solved, right? So now it's, instead of you reacting to everything, instead of being reactive, you're going to become proactive and figure out and adopt that problem-solving mindset. He then presents 3 different unique solutions to any type of situation. And the 3 types of solutions are the following. He says that sometimes the situation in which a man finds himself may require him to shape his own fate by action. So take an immediate action, doing something specifically. At other times, it is more advantageous for him to make use of an opportunity for contemplation and to realize the assets in his way. At other times, it is more advantageous for him to make use of an opportunity for contemplation and to utilize the assets that he has. And lastly, sometimes man may be required simply to accept fate and to bear his cross. A lot of situations call for immediate action. In other times, it calls for contemplation and to use the things that you have at your disposal, the tools that you have around you. And sometimes the situation is just so bad and there's just truly nothing you can do. And yeah, you have to do nothing but simply accept your fate and go into it with a good attitude and try your best at whatever it is. He then asked the other poor inmates who listened to him actively in the darkness of the hut to face up to the seriousness of their position, and that they must not lose hope, but should keep their courage in the certainty that the hopelessness of their struggle did not detract from the dignity and its meaning. He says this, which I think is very powerful, is he says that someone looks down on each one of us in a difficult time, right? Whether it be a friend, a wife, somebody dead or alive, or even God, if you're a believer. And he would not expect us to disappoint them. But we would hope that that person or that thing that's looking down on us would find us suffering proudly, not miserably, knowing how to die. This makes me think about all the hard times that I went through in my life personally. And I think about all the peers around me, all the family, all my friends, all the people who believed in me. Despite the hard times that I was going through, I also hope that none of my friends or none of my peers felt the hard times that I was going through just because they might have been radiating off me. I hope that my friends and my family, they could have looked at me and they could have said, damn, what he's going through is very hard, very tough, but you know what? He's keeping his chin up. He has a good attitude and he's going after it regardless of what obstacles lay ahead of him. And what that does to me personally is it just motivates me even more. It gets me even more fired up. So this is something that I call upon pretty often, specifically when I go through hard times in my life, because it makes me think about something that's bigger than me. When you don't have much to draw on yourself, that's how you draw upon a bigger purpose. You look past yourself. You look at your surroundings. You look at your beliefs. You look at the people around you, and you try to draw upon them for extra power. Then what's talked about is, towards the end of the book, is after they were actually released from the camp. He talks about during the psychological phase, one observed that people with natures of a more primitive kind could not escape the influences of the brutality which had surrounded them in camp life. What he's basically saying is that some people that went through the camp life, they couldn't maintain their optimistic mindset, right? So what had happened was these people basically became, products and influenced of the camp because it was so difficult, and maybe there might have been crazy people, but it was just such a brutalist environment that these people adopted some of those brutalist tendencies because that's what their environment was, understandably. Now, being free, they thought that they could use their freedom latentiously, but what they didn't know that changed for them was that they were now the oppressors instead of the oppressed. What they became was instigators and not objects of willful force and injustice. What they did was they justified their behavior by their own terrible experiences. And then this is Victor following up with the story here. A friend was walking across a field with me toward the camp when suddenly we came to a field of green crops. Automatically, I avoided it, but my friend drew his arm through mine and dragged me through it. I said something about not treading down the young crops. He then became annoyed and gave me an angry look and shouted, "You don't say! And hasn't enough been taken from us already? My wife and child have been gassed, not to mention everything else. And you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats?" Only slowly could these men be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has the right to do wrong, not even if wrong has been done onto them. This chapter then talks about a man that he is interviewing many years later after they leave the camp. And it talks about a man who, in his words, for years had thought he had reached the absolute limit of all possible suffering, and now found that suffering has no limits and that he could suffer still more and more and more intensely. I just think that's so relatable because that's one of the reasons why I try to be very optimistic every day. It's because despite how horrible today was, maybe someone wrecked my car, the good thing is that I'm still living, right? Because you never want to underestimate how bad your day can get and how much worse it can truly get. This reminds me of business, and whenever I had a $10,000, $15,000 credit card bill that I couldn't even pay. I had no money to pay off my card. My card was completely overdue, and I was carrying a balance for the following month, but I was very optimistic about it though. The reason I was very optimistic about it was because I had 2 or 3 properties that I was going to close on and make some money on, so I would have been able to pay off my credit card with no problem. Right? So I was in a bad situation, but I thought I had reached the worst possible avenue for that to get. But what really ended up happening was my situation got extremely worse. And one of those properties I wasn't able to close on because there were some issues with the title company. The second one, that one wasn't able to close because the seller backed out. And the third one didn't end up closing either. And so now what I was left with was I was left with not just a $15,000 credit card bill, but 3 properties that I was absolutely betting on for them to close for me to pay off my credit card. And none of them panned out. So if there's anything that you can do is never underestimate how bad the suffering can be and how much worse it can actually get. In the second half of the book, which is really good, where I think most of the gems come from, which is outside of the storytelling, is the logotherapy, right? So it's a logotherapy in a nutshell. What logotherapy is basically is it's a type of counseling that helps people find meaning and purpose in their lives, essentially. The essence of existence. The more one forgets himself, by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human he is and the more he actualizes himself, Victor claims. He then follows this up with what he believes to be the meaning of life in 3 different ways. Number 1 is by creating a specific type of work or doing a specific type of deed. Number 2 is by experiencing something or encountering someone. It can be by a relationship, by someone you love, anything like that. And 3, which he adopted in the concentration camp, is by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. Here's an example of how you can draw the meaning of suffering from what you might be going through. Here's an example he follows. Once an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years ago, before him. He says, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the following question. What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first, and your wife would have to survive you? Oh, he said. For her, this would have been horrible. She would have suffered a whole lot. He then replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her from this suffering. Now at the price that you have to survive and mourn her. The doctor then said no word, but shook his hand and calmly left the office. In some sort of way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. This ties back to what we talked about earlier and how you can draw meaning from something bigger than just yourself by looking at it through a different lens and a different perspective. He then says, of course, this was no therapy in the proper sense. His despair was no disease, And second, he could not change his fate. He could not retrieve his wife. But in that moment, he did succeed in changing his attitude toward his intolerable fate. But from that time on, he could at least see a meaning in his suffering. A really great point here is that one of the basic tenets of logotherapy, that man's main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but rather to see a meaning in his life. That is why he claims that any man is ready to suffer on the condition that his suffering has a meaning. Pandeterminism is something that's heavily talked about towards the end of the book, which is one of those foundational principles that any man, any young man should live by, that is absolutely crucial to their own well-being. And it's the following: the idea or view of man which disregards his own capacity to take a stand toward any conditions whatsoever. That man is not fully conditioned and predetermined, but rather determines himself whether he gives into circumstances or stands up to them. Man is self-determining. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence will be, what he will become in the very next moment. Man is capable of changing the world, and by the very least, of changing himself for the better. What he becomes within the limits of endowment and environment is fully up to oneself. Man has potentialities within himself. Whichever one is actualized depends on decisions and not on conditions.